So now I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, David Bahnsen. David is a native Californian, born in Torrance, raised in Irvine, and his day job is as managing partner and chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group, a wealth management firm based in Newport Beach. David's been recognized by Forbes and Barron's as one of America's top advisors. He has a national reputation as a contributor for Forbes and National Review, where he writes on the intersection between markets and politics. You might recognize him for his frequent appearances on CNBC, Fox Business, Bloomberg, and others. He is the author of several books, the latest of which was just released. It's titled Full Time: Work and the Meaning of Life, where he posits that work is, in fact, the meaning of life. Copies of this book will be available for signature and purchase after our event today. Please help me welcome David Bahnsen.
And I assure you, I have never come out to give a speech to that song before. But I have heard the song many times. It is the opening intro to a podcast I do every week for National Review on capital markets. It's called Capital Record. And they asked if they could use that song for the intro, and I didn't have the heart to tell them that I have never walked out to hit a baseball to a theme song, and doing it to a speech is even weirder. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I appreciate some of you who groaned when you heard that my book suggested that work was the meaning of life. But since I'm here to talk about economic growth, I would like you all to try what happens to a society that finds out that golf is the meaning of life. It will not be good for productivity. I want to talk in the brief time I have with you today about three things. Number one, why growth matters. Number two, what is impacting economic growth nationally. And number three, what can be done about it. I want to do a brief history lesson with you here today. And I believe that you'll find some of these statistics daunting, some very interesting, and some surprising. But what we are dealing with right now, not merely here in Ventura County or in Southern California or in the state of California, not merely in the western side of the United States, and frankly not really only in the United States. But I believe that the 2008 global financial crisis that many of us have forgotten about, that it belongs in the rearview mirror in many ways, certainly in the case of asset prices, whether it be the stock market or residential housing. But nevertheless, I believe the 2008 global financial crisis served as a seminal moment in economic history that we have yet to write the second half of the book about. Let me give you a brief historical backdrop. Real GDP growth, that is economic growth, net of inflation, as you know, from the time World War II was done through 2007, before the global financial crisis ensued, averaged a compound annual growth rate of 3.13% per year. In that, let's call it 65-year period of time, recessions happened, 10 to be precise. Well, after the Great Depression and up till before and not including the Great Recession of 2008 and 9, we had 10 recessions. 1949, 53, 57, 60, 70, 74, 80, a double dip recession in 82, the savings and loan crisis of 90, and a very mild recession in 2002. You'll notice for a while there, some of those years I was reading off were about 3 to 4 years apart, like clockwork. Then all of a sudden things started to get a little more lumpy, a little bit more unpredictable in a good way. We went a pretty long period of time after the double dip recession in the very early 1980s before the savings and loan induced recession in 1990. We then had over a decade till what was a very mild recession in 2002. And then, of course, we had the mother of them all in our lifetimes in 2008. But nevertheless, a $2 trillion economy, measured by total gross output, the gross domestic product of the United States, post-war, $2 trillion, became a $17 trillion economy before the financial crisis, an 8.5 times growth of the overall level of goods and services in our economy. What did this mean? Well, before I talk about the aggregate statistics, I want to make sure I, at the outset, approach this on a per individual basis, because economics becomes very popular when you implement a necessary component of population growth. Ultimately, I have not found a better definition for what we mean by growth than population plus productivity. The two things are overlapped, but they are separate, but they, when combined together, equal what we mean by economic growth. And if, in theory, you have a country that's total aggregate economic growth is growing, but per capita is not, you have people not getting richer, meaning not having a higher quality of life, meaning not enjoying greater prosperity, and even as the aggregate level in the country might be just simply in total perfect concert or proportionality to the population. It's very, very rare for that to happen. It's very hard for that to happen. And in fact, it did not happen in the United States. So besides me telling you that a $2 trillion economy became a $17 trillion economy before the financial crisis, I will tell you that per capita, it was in 1980. All right, now at this point, I'm already the coolest first grader in Irvine, California. Reagan has not yet quite been elected, but he's on his way to being elected, and we're about to go through a couple decades of great economic growth, the 80s and 90s. And I love using the 80s and 90s as examples, not only for the obvious historical reality of it, but it really allows this conversation to be the incredibly nonpartisan conversation it should be, because you had a Republican president through the 80s and a Democrat president through the 90s. Nobody can accuse me of trying to attach this fallaciously to some sort of partisan loyalty. The 80s and 90s, per capita GDP growth, $12,000 in 1980, 2007, before the financial crisis, $48,000. A quadrupling, 4x in 27 years of GDP per capita. Since 2007, that 48K per capita has gone to 64K. So 5.3% per year GDP per capita growth from 1980 to 2007, 1.8% for the last 17 years. We're now not in a period where the COVID interruption is a statistical aberration, because the brief period of time that it brought numbers down has now been followed by a brief period of time where it pulled numbers up, and it is back into the pre-COVID trend line, as underwhelming as that trend line was. There were 60 million jobs in 1946. There were 90 million jobs by 1980. There were 146 million jobs in 2007, above and beyond population growth, admittedly somewhat complicated by the addition of two-income households. Corporate profits, this statistic is just absolutely overwhelming. $20 billion of aggregate corporate profits, 1946. $1.5 trillion aggregate corporate profits measured in the S&P 500. So significantly more corporate profits in total, but measured by the same 500 largest publicly traded companies in the US, from 20 billion to 1.5 trillion. And then the national average of wages grew 14 times, double the rate of inflation from 1946 to 2007. every statistic, it seems, I just shared seems overwhelmingly positive. Why are we even doing this conference? Why am I here? Well, the second part of the data points are what I want to bring to your attention. Post-crisis, a $17 trillion size economy has gone to $22 trillion in a 16-year period, 1.7% compound annual growth rate. Recall the prior number was almost double that. The labor participation force that had peaked before the financial crisis, whereby 67% of our adult population was either working or looking for work, has now come down to 62%. Well over 10 million people who have voluntarily removed themselves from the workforce. What is going on? What has been the consequence and some of the causation of this stagnation, this slowdown, this interruption in U.S. post-World War II economic life? First of all, I want to make clear about wage stagnation. This is a very difficult issue because there are partisans and there are agendas that want to use wage growth, cherry-picked start and end dates to make a particular point. And whether they're trying to make a point that might be suitable to one economic or political worldview or to the other economic or political worldview, like all figures, they don't lie, but liars certainly figure. And there is a way to make any conclusion come you want out of the wage data. But there isn't a way for any of it to be particularly valid in this one sense. People often are measuring the amount received by employees, which is what we call wages, which is what I would think would be quite important to an employee, and not measuring the cost of the employee, which are two entirely different things. They create an apples to not oranges, but an apples to a car tire analogy, but in fact are used as if they're interchangeable. Why has employee cost skyrocketed when employee wages in many cases appear to have stagnated, although that has improved to some degree? The cost of litigation, liability, termination, there is a significant legal apparatus that has dramatically changed much of hiring for larger companies. There is a greater cost for companies in terms of retirement than there used to be, either those still running defined benefit plans that have a greater funding need through the pensions, or more often through the matching requirements of a 401k or defined contribution plan, oftentimes stock options and other things of that nature. But far and away, the largest cost increase is the cost of health benefits. And that is not included or mentioned in wage stagnation. So you can get two things that are all at once true. A skyrocketing increase in what it costs to have an employee, and yet a reasonably unimpressive amount of growth in what an employee might be getting paid. Number two, and this is going to really correlate to some of the other things I want to say about what I think is going wrong in economic growth since 2007. A near evaporation of business investment. For those familiar with the ingredients of GDP, gross domestic product, when we are done looking at consumption, which everyone fallaciously obsesses with, when we are done looking at trade and imports, exports, and done looking at government spending and contribution to the economy, the other ingredient is called non-residential fixed investment, and it is essentially a reference to business investment. What businesses are investing in structures, equipment, projects, and intellectual property. I hate to tell you, but there is nothing to consume in an economy where nothing is produced. You're welcome to write that down, and I'll take any questions about that particular statement I just made, which may be the most profound economic statement you will hear today. That there must be production to drive consumption. Why has business investment largely evaporated? Well, a huge portion of this has to be, in the most nonpartisan way imaginable, attributed to a statistical anomaly that is almost unfathomable to those who study history. And that is a crowding out in the private sector of government spending. Now, why do I say this is nonpartisan? Anybody who's going after government spending sure sounds like some crazy right-winger to me, right? Of course, this is absurd because anyone objectively looking at it, including a crazy right-winger like me, is well aware of the fact that this is the most bipartisan situation we have in American politics. They all like to spend money. And we can argue about what expenditures are legitimate, which ones are not legitimate, which ones we like that are happening, which ones we don't like. It is totally immaterial at this point to the point I'm making. That total government spending, first I'm going to do something no one ever does, and I'm going to include local and state government with federal as a percentage of the economy. Because of the nature of American government and the federalist society we have, the total amount of economic contribution coming from local, state, and federal government was 20% post-World War II and has now reached 37% and almost doubling. But because we focus so much on the federal government, for the very logical reason it's the only category that applies to all 50 states equally, when we say 37% in aggregate, that means something very different to somebody in Texas than it does to somebody in Ventura County. It means something very different to somebody in a particular part of Vermont than it might a particular part of Idaho. And much like the weather is only relevant where you are, I don't think people in Wisconsin care much about what is going on in the weather in Florida. The aggregate data of what's happening with state and local crowding out of a private sector economy is very localized by definition. But the federal is not. 10.8% of GDP was represented by government spending in 1947. That number was 19% in 2007, and we basically spent almost the entire time between 15 and 20%, vacillating. There was one brief period in that double-dip recession of 82 where it went above 20 just for a minute. But more or less, we've been between 15 and 20. And you say that's really interesting because government spending skyrocketed in that period. Government debt skyrocketed. But so did the denominator. And this is the entire message I have about growth as an imperative. That debt to GDP, which involves a numerator and a denominator, is really the operative conversation. It's really what matters when we evaluate economic growth and opportunity. Focusing only on the nominal or absolute level of debt leads to a mistake. It views the debt itself separated from what is happening in the underlying economy. I think, and the way I always prove this is that Apple has $200 billion of debt, and my deadbeat kid brother has about $6,000, and I assure you Apple's a better investment than my deadbeat kid brother. By the way, my brother's not a deadbeat. I would have never used him as an example if it were real. I just had to throw something out there. It's funny because I know enough deadbeats, you'd think I could make up a real one, but. The debt divided by GDP that had stayed between 15 and 20% through 6 decades of real economic growth, through 6 decades of substantial wage expansion, corporate profit expansion, job expansion, that ratio, regardless of what some of the right or left would have liked to spend a little more money here, a little less money there, the internal or intramural debates about defense spending versus social services, it's immaterial from a macroeconomic standpoint. 15 to 20% was a ratio of debt to GDP, and we have now firmly entrenched a new bandwidth of 20 to 25%. I see no scenario by which we are getting back to 15 to 20. Now, politically, someone may embrace this. I only bring it up because economically, we have to understand that there is 5% that has come out of the private sector, but the private sector has not grown to that point. And ideologically, it doesn't take any partisan bend to understand that the more productive aspects of the economy, meaning producing goods and services that meet the needs of humanity, that lead to jobs, lead to profits, and lead to wages, that those things are taking place in the part of the economy that is getting crowded out, the private sector. Where is there room to give here? 22% of federal outlays go to Social Security. I don't think anyone believes that's getting cut. 14% goes to health care benefits, 12% to Medicare, 4% to veteran services, 9% to various forms of social welfare and needs-based, 3% to social services. That's 64% of federal spending tied to some form of transfer payments, many of which people like and believe in, some of which maybe they think could be reformed. But the point is, they're not very easily politically touchable. There's not a lot of room to give there. Now, in the current economy, would we say this has been disastrous? We went from 3.1 to 1.7. We went from a robust job creation to much less, but we still have largely an employed society. Corporate profits have grown a great deal. What exactly is the problem? I think you're in what I had thought about titling my speech today, a glasses half empty and glasses half full economy, in the sense that, well, manufacturing has declined 13 months in a row. Factory construction is up 75% over the last year. Unemployment is well below 4%. They would have always historically referred to the current employment level as full employment, 3.6, 3.7, but the labor participation force remains really substantially lower. The trade deficit is down. That's good. The total level of global trade is down. That's not good. Japan's economy is better in many ways. China's economy is worse in many ways. Housing prices have not really collapsed. Housing sales volume has totally collapsed. Housing demand has not collapsed. Housing supply has collapsed. Core goods inflation is gone. Core services inflation is not gone. Do you see my point? With almost every opportunity to compare and contrast the economy, right now one has to be rather humble, rather lukewarm. What do I think can be done to restore some form of economic growth? Why do I believe this is so important? I'll conclude with the why this economic growth matters. Along the way, the basic constructs that I think are largely but not completely removed from any sort of political conversation, but become basic macroeconomic, fundamental, aspirational, achievable policy aims, and in some cases, cultural aims. Number one, tort reform. It ought not to be so easy to sue somebody for laying somebody off. The only reason that doesn't get more applause is some of you haven't been through it. Number two, labor dynamism. No matter what people want to say about the sentimentality of never moving, of staying at the same company for 30 years, of staying in the same house for 30 years, a labor force that is dynamic is pivotal to a society achieving economic growth, and that was a huge ingredient in post-World War II through the 80s and 90s, into the 2000s of our economic growth. A dynamic labor force with high degrees of mobility. Number three, a stable monetary policy. The end of boom-bust cycles, what we have largely been in now for decades. High degree of boom in asset prices, think .com, think housing, think condos in Las Vegas, think Chinese stocks, think artificial intelligence. Oh, sorry, I'm not supposed to. Followed by significant busts that periodically wipe out 20, 30, 40, 50% of aforementioned values. Capital allocation to productive areas of the economy. During one of the earlier introductions, I believe the city manager made reference to a company here in Thousand Oaks that's received $130 million of venture capital. And if I heard correctly, it was in a biotech space for R&D around something to do with opioid alternatives. Let me say something. This is seriously the most nonpartisan thing I'll say today, because I have friends on the right and the left that are guilty of this. If you view venture capital and private equity and robust financial markets as the enemy, then you are anti-growth. Now, this does not mean that we need special rules and favors for them. It doesn't mean we have to like them at parties. It simply means that part of what funds local biotech companies is robust venture capital. The capital markets of the United States made us the most economically vibrant country on earth. And to the extent that we want to go to war with capital markets, we are going to war with economic growth. Capital allocation not only requires strong capital markets, but you must have a less distortive monetary policy. Years and years and years and years of 0% interest rates do basically two things. One, boost housing prices to a level where no one can afford to buy one. If you don't believe me, ask all of your friends how many of them can afford to buy their own house. The number right now is significantly lower of Americans who could afford to buy their own house than it was in 2007. Number two, years and years and years of zero interest rates distorts decision-making in the economy. It allows capital to be misallocated to less productive places, like Japan did for 30 years. And prevents it from going into new technologies, to new innovations, to what I said before was non-residential fixed investment, to the CapEx and business investment necessary to create the new goods and services that lead to entire new tiers of real economic growth. We must have a resurgence in manufacturing and R&D and industrial production. If we are to go from a $25 billion level of non-residential fixed investment in 1947 to $2 trillion in 2008, 7.5% annual growth of business investment in that 60-year period, and now, since 2007, 1.9%. That's all that's missing. The economy is not slowing its growth because consumers are spending less. If it is, just tell me who these consumers are that are spending less. It's completely ridiculous, our obsession with consumer confidence and retail sales. Here's a little trick for you. How do you know when Americans stop spending? When their credit cards are maxed out. That's it. All of us are just playing one long game of let's make a deal. That's it. Americans love to spend money. What has slowed economic growth is production. We must bring back a vibrant sense of non-residential fixed investment. We must bring back housing supply. One of the greatest economic travesties, and at this point I am totally comfortable saying not only is this a bipartisan policy error, and not only is this an economic and in many cases a political error, but it is a moral error. It is untrue that it is good for an economy to limit the supply of new housing. We must celebrate entrepreneurialism and risk-taking, and ultimately allow these things to lead to the private sector growth that is available to us if we will have it. And then finally, and this is the subject of the book, some of you I think were booing, it does us no good, my friends, to build 75% more factories. It does us no good to onshore much of the manufacturing that previously had been offshored. It does us no good to provide corporate welfare to companies to go invest in semiconductor manufacturing locally. It does us no good to take all these policy steps if when all is said and done, we're not going to get the workers. The labor participation force must come higher. We must celebrate the basic American ideal of hard work, or we will not restore a culture of economic growth. And I use that word culture in my concluding sentence here on purpose. That is the need of the hour, a culture of work and a policy framework of growth. Choose to focus on tax, deregulation, school choice, healthcare, all the different policy issues that are out there. My point economically is to say the need of the hour is a culture of work and a policy framework of growth. The results will not merely be higher share prices on Wall Street, but more importantly, the human flourishing that comes from greater jobs, higher real wages, projects that meet human needs and wants, and the opportunities embedded in an aspirational society. Thank you very much.